Deep in the heart of China lies Shandong province. And deep in the heart of Shandong province is one of the 5 holy mountains of China, Taishan. And apparently, for over 1,000 years, there have been masters, spiritual masters, that gather in the caves of Mount Tai. And according to folklore, there was a young student of philosophy at Beijing University, and he had heard about these masters that live in Mount Taishan, and he wanted to go and visit one and get all the wisdom that they had. So he took the train from Beijing all the way to Shandong province, and he climbed the 10,000 stairs to the top of Mount Tai, and then he went walking in the mountains, looking for a master. The hours went by, and one day he actually came across a master in a cave. Couldn't believe it. What amazing luck. He actually found one of these spiritual masters. And he sat with the master and he said, "Master, I'm so glad I found you. Could you tell me the secrets to life?" And the master said, "Sure." So the master began teaching, and hardly a moment went by when the student didn't interrupt and say, "Well, that's not been my experience," or "Look, according to the literature I've seen, it's different," or "Well, you know, I'm not so sure about that. XYZ says ABC." And he kept on interrupting again and again and again. The master was watching this. Finally, the master stopped, and he said, "Would you like a cup of tea?" And the student said, "Sure." So the master began pouring the tea into his cup. And the student was watching as the master continued to pour the tea, overflowing. So the student watched as the tea kept on pouring, overflowing onto the table, then from the table, down the legs of the table, and still the master kept on pouring the tea, till finally the student couldn't stand it any longer. And he said, "Stop, sir, stop. Can't you see that the cup's full? No more will go in." And the master said, "Your mind is like this cup. How can I put anything new into it unless you come to me with an empty cup?" And the reason I say this is that there's a lot of highly successful managers in this room. And we're dealing with an extremely successful company over the last 20 years in Amgen. So I have not come here to tell you how to do anything, truly. All I'm going to do is tell you a little about what I've learned in running businesses for the last 23 years. And all I ask is that you keep your cup empty. Now, I want to talk about a few of the concepts of leadership that have resonated most with me, and see if they resonate with you. The first one is candor. I believe that great leaders have a spirit of candor, of honesty, of telling it like it is. And I'm certainly not alone in thinking that. If you look at the history of great corporations, it's overflowing with leaders that had the characteristic of candor. And one of the classics, of course, is Jack Welch. And any student of management will know that Jack Welch is widely regarded as one of the, if not the greatest manager of people from a corporation point of view in modern history. And you look at the results of General Electric during his tenure, and it's absolutely extraordinary. Fortune magazine voted him manager of the century. So, how do you do that? What was the reason he became manager of the century? Now, was it his philosophy of coming in and saying we are going to be number 1 or number 2 in every single sector, or we will sell the company? Radical philosophy. No, it wasn't that, in Welch's opinion. Was it his radical system of differentiation where, believe it or not, every year General Electric would sack the bottom 10% of their staff according to their rankings? Radical and even outrageous. But according to Welch, that was not what made General Electric successful. What most made General Electric successful was, in his opinion, candor, telling it like it is. So the question I've got for you is, what's your candor like? And what I'd like you to do during my little talk is just rate yourself. No one will ever see the ranking. Well, just rank yourself 1 out of 10 in each of the areas. Because throughout corporate history, you see Candor coming up again and again. I was on a website last week of Bridgewater Associates. Anyone ever heard of Bridgewater Associates? They're the #1 hedge fund in the world. They have currently funds 58.9 billion under management. Now, as you can imagine, you don't even get to 1 billion under management unless you're pretty good, let alone $58.9 billion under management. That's a lot of trust, isn't it, that's been given to them. How do they get that? Well, I've been doing a bit of work studying Ray Dalio, the head of Bridgewater, and he has been the head of Bridgewater for decades. And he's quite an interesting guy. He's been meditating, for instance, every day for 20 years. And he's got some pretty interesting views on management as well. His founding philosophy on, once again, why Bridgewater was successful was honesty, even brutal honesty at times. Now, I'm not suggesting you go as far as Ray Dalio. He has a system where apparently every conversation is recorded and can be played back if anyone disputes what anyone said. He has a philosophy where if you say something about someone else, they must be in the room. You are not allowed to say anything about anybody else unless they're in the room. And juniors, the most junior in the company, is allowed to say anything and critique anything the most senior people in the company are allowed to say. So it's pretty hardcore, but once again, you see his belief that it's Candor that has really brought the his fund and his business alive. This is not just in business, of course. You see it throughout leaders in history. I mean, look at Winston Churchill. If ever there was a no-bull guy, it was Winston Churchill. I remember reading about Churchill that he once sent a letter to the heads of the Royal Navy. And the letter said this: please explain on one side of one piece of paper how the Royal Navy is adapting to modern warfare. Now that is someone who's getting down to the essence of stuff, isn't it? One side of one piece of paper. And he's, of course, you know, great leaders are how they are all through their life. So it's not just in his work life that Churchill was no bull, it was also in his personal life. There was this story that there was this woman who didn't like him at a party, and she said, Winston Churchill, if I was your wife, I would put poison in your wine. And Winston said, madam, if I was your husband, I would drink it. And it's a very, very powerful thing. Rank yourself out of 10. Just to yourself, how are you at Candor? The second area of leadership that I think is greatly underestimated is appreciation. Appreciation. Now I'm going to tell you an amazing research study done by Gallup, one of the largest research companies in the world. Now this study was done over 4 million workers in 30 different industries. And here was the primary result. Do you know what they found out was the #1 driving force for why people want to stay in a company? Why the people under you want to work under you? It's not money. Everybody thinks it's money. You know what it is? It's appreciation. It's appreciation. How much appreciation, how much affirming of your people are you actually doing? Is it a lot? Is it little? Is it enough? Well, Gallup have a concept called bucket and dipper. And they say that during the course of the day, there are literally hundreds of interactions that you have with your staff and with your other leaders. And at every point, it's like you've got an invisible bucket with a little dipper. And you can either add from your bucket to theirs, or you can take from their bucket. And when you add to their bucket, you also get filled. And they certainly do as well. And it's a really interesting paradigm, isn't it? Because if you just take the last 24 hours when you've been with your staff, how many times have you added to their bucket versus taken from their bucket? Knowing that Gallup has shown the appreciation is the #1 reason that people are actually coming to work, believe it or not. So if you look at the study, you find that appreciation has increased productivity. Those managers who truly appreciate versus the average, it has increased productivity. It has increased the length of time staff stay with an organisation. Staff who have, rather customers that work with managers or their connects with the company that appreciate them, rank that person much higher, according to Gallup. And they even have better safety records, those that feel that they're appreciated. So it's really a company transforming way to be to become an appreciation manager. Now, I'm not talking about being Pollyanna and not pointing out problems. On the contrary, when you have a culture of having appreciated them, they can handle direct instructions, direct observations. And one of the best techniques I ever learned, which must have been in my early 20s, it was from the 1 Minute Manager, 25 years ago. Anyone read that book, 1 Minute Manager? Brilliant book, yeah, quite a few people, yeah. And it was the 1 minute criticism. It is so beautiful. It is, when you do a 1 minute criticism, you say something appreciative, you then tell them your issue, and then you say something appreciative. So let's say that someone didn't do a good report, just something basic. You go, Jane, I really valued what you've been doing on this project over the last 3 months. I have to tell you that I thought this report probably wasn't up to your normal standards. So maybe it's worth more time for these monthly reports. But I just want to say it's fantastic what you're doing, and you've made a huge difference overall to us in the last quarter. So notice that the 1 minute criticism, that I've shortened that, but the 1 minute criticism, when it actually critiqued, it was direct. It wasn't, running around the issue. But because it's in a sandwich of appreciation, you know that person's going to be fine with it, don't you? And we are all, including myself, guilty, I think, of not doing a transaction like that, where we're imparting information, but still energizing the person. So I think appreciation is really important. And here's an amazing fact, that it's not just in your work life, but it's even more in your personal life. And there's an incredible story by Dr. John Gottman, who is one of the preeminent relationship experts in researchers in the world. And I think it's just in my top handful of amazing research stats. He sat down with his researchers with over 700 newlywed couples for 15 minutes, and he videoed them together. And 10 years later, he came back, and he had predicted with 94% accuracy which couples would be together in 10 years and which wouldn't. So how did he do that? It was the amount of criticism and negative inputs versus positive inputs. And being the scientist that he is, it's come out at a particular number, which is 5 to 1. If you're giving 5 positive inputs for every 1 negative in your relationship, it is almost certain statistically that you'll be together in 10 years. And you know what better get on the phone. And you know what the divorce rate is, the statistic of interaction, positive and negative? It's 0.8 to 1. So if you're even 1 to 1 of positive and negatives, that is not a good place to be in your relationship. So it's the power of appreciation. How would you rank yourself out of 10 in appreciating your staff? The next area that I think is really important in leadership is to really listen. Now the emphasis is on really, because look, our lives are so busy, aren't they? I mean, it's ridiculous how much multitasking we tend to be doing. But the one time you can't multitask, but we often do with people underneath us, we don't do it with our bosses, with people underneath us, is listening. And listening is one of those times where you must be fully present. You cannot be doing your emails while someone is talking to you. We often do that, particularly with junior people. We need to give them full attention, and so that they feel they've been heard. And that's so hard to do, isn't it? When you've got so much on and it seems a trivial thing in your life to what they're saying to you. But in their lives, it may be important. It may be actually really something to even be talking to you, depending on what your rank is in the organisation. Stephen Covey, one of the greats of modern management, said, seek first to understand and then to be understood. And he said if you live your life in communication with others like that, then it's a profoundly different life to if you live with yourself as the primary purpose of the interaction. It's a great question to ask yourself, how much time do I spend on broadcast versus receive? Broadcast, receive. How much time do you spend? The Iroquois Indians solved this centuries ago. They had this concept called the talking stick. And what would happen is when they were having a meeting, even an argument, the person who could talk was given the talking stick, and no one was allowed to say anything. Couldn't interrupt until they thought they'd been heard. And then they'd pass the talking stick on to someone else. And the same thing would happen. Now you look at, because of the familiarity that we've developed in our companies, you look at how we ignore the Indian talking stick system, but it's quite magnificent. And at the heart of it, it's got such respect. A respect that familiarity often reduces in a fast-moving corporation. I've spoken to two people who've interacted with Bill Clinton, and they both said they felt like they were the only person in the room, and they only had a couple of minutes with him at a function. And he is famous for that. He is famous for really making you feel that he is devoted and cares about what you say. It's a magnificent quality. And undoubtedly, it was instrumental in him getting to the point where his own party put him forward for president. What's yours like? I was coached for quite a while by an American performance coach by the name of Jim Fannin. And I was very interested in this guy because he coached many of the top sports people in America, including Alex Rodriguez, the highest paid baseballer in the world. And he taught me a great technique, which I'd like to share with you and see if it's of use. And it's called the 90-second rule. And whenever you haven't seen anyone for 2 hours or longer, whether it's at work or at home, you're there for the first 90 seconds, you are upbeat, you are listening, you are there for them. You are fully present for them. And all it takes is 90 seconds. And then you, hopefully, don't go back to some other way, but you can continue on. And that seems such a small amount of time, but the number of people I've told this to have said, that is amazing, I've done that with my staff, and it just changes their perception of me. Because when they see me, I'm like this in the first second. Very powerful technique. The other technique you can use is the therapist rule. And the therapist rule, if you've ever been to a therapist, you may not know what that they're actually doing this to you, but most cognitive behavioural therapists will use this technique. And what they do, and what I recommend that you do in your own leadership situations, is that you repeat back to somebody what they said. So when you're with a therapist, you'll say, oh, I can't believe it, I'm having all these problems with my friend Bob, he just doesn't understand me and he's putting too much pressure on me. And they'll go on for a few minutes and the therapist will say, so you're feeling that Bob really doesn't get where you're at, he doesn't understand what you're doing? And you say, yeah, I think that. And what happens is, they think this person understands me. Now when I illustrate it like that, it seems really obvious, but therapists right now are doing it all around the world and no one sees it. It's a classic cognitive behavior methodology for making people feel that you have empathy and that you understand the situation. Priceless technique. How do you rank in really listening? The next area of leadership I think that's really important is energy. You know, Jack Welch said it's not about being the chief executive officer with your people, it's about being the chief energy officer. That's your main role to energize them. And the bigger the number of people under your command, the more it's about energizing them to be the best that they can be, because you know they're talented. I mean, they pass no end of tests to get into the company. It's just about getting their best self out, isn't it? And you know, in your own experience, how the best self comes out is when you feel energized by someone, enabled, encouraged. So energy, I think, is in two areas. The first is your own energy, in your personal attitude. Now, there has been a lot of talk and even a lot of criticism about the power of optimism. And a lot of people over the decades would poo-poo optimism as being kind of the philosophy of dreamers. Until about 1985, and it's a lot harder to poo-poo it because of the rise of an area of psychology known as positive psychology, led by originally by Donald Clifton and most prominently now by Professor Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania. And if you Google positive psychology, you'll see Seligman's at the heart of a lot of what's happening. And really, it all stemmed from the fact that until the mid-80s, there was an obsession with working out in psychology what was wrong with people, not what was right. In fact, as an example, there are 14 papers written on depression for every one on happiness. So Seligman and a few others said, well, what happens if we're dealing with normal people who aren't sick? Isn't it where psychology should start to really focus, because there's a lot more of them? The people like us. How do you make the normal person excellent rather than the sick person normal? And that's where positive psychology came through. And a lot of it centered around the power of optimism, but this time it had scientific rigor behind it. And there's countless studies. I don't have time to give them all to you, but there is just a wonderful array of research now on how being optimistic transforms the environment around you and transforms your own performance. You know, Seligman did a study with MetLife, the insurance company, and first of all, he ranked, with his team, he ranked who were pessimists and who were optimists, and found out that in the insurance world, the optimists made 37% more money than the people who came through as pessimists. And insurance is an interesting area because you eat what you kill. You don't, you're on some base commission, but basically your whole salary really is your success. So it's quite rigorous from a point of view. It's quite hard as a measure, I think. And you see this all the way through life. Another one of Seligman's studies, you're liked a lot more if you're optimistic. Now, you don't have to be a genius to work that out. But how many of us drag whatever phone call we've been on, whatever meeting we've just come through, whatever issue we have at home, into our next interaction with the people underneath us, rather than saying, okay, I'm walking in here optimistic regardless. Incidentally, optimism dramatically increases your lifespan, according to Seligman's research. You know the Mayo Clinic, many people will know the Mayo Clinic in the States. They did a 30-year study, and over 839 people, they mapped the optimists versus pessimists, and found there was a significant increase in lifespan to people who measured in the optimistic category. Also a study done on 180 Catholic nuns. And nuns are actually a really beautiful research sample because they eat the same food and they do the same thing. So they're actually quite good for a human behavioural sample. And once again, the optimist nuns lived longer than the pessimist nuns. And just anecdotally, I was amazed when I read, I've done a lot of study on anti-aging, and I read, I'm actually 72. I read about the longest living person in the world via good records. There's disputes, people out in the mountains say that they're really old or whatever, but the longest world documented living person in the world was a woman, a French woman, by the name of Jean Carmen. And she lived to 122. There's no dispute about the records. And she was known for her optimism. I mean, this is only anecdotal, but she was quite amazing. At 85, she took up fencing. Can you imagine that? At 100, she was still riding a bicycle. And she kept this humour and optimism throughout her whole life. For example, one day she was being interviewed by a journalist, and they said, how many wrinkles have you got, Jean? And she said, I've only got one and I'm sitting on it. And also interesting thing about Jean Calment was when she was in the mid-80s, this real estate agent who thought he was being very clever did a deal and said, Jean, I'd like to pay you for your house now. I'll only pay you this amount of money, but you can have it now. When you die, I'll take it over. She died about 20 years after him. At 85, he sat there for about 25 years waiting for his pot of gold that never came. So that's your personal attitude of energy, I think, is centered around optimism. And then there's physical energy. And there, I'd like to cite the work of the Human Performance Institute in Florida, which is just a magnificent institution. Actually just got bought by Johnson & Johnson. And for over 20 years, they started off researching sportsmen. So Pete Sampras, Monica Seles, a lot of Olympians went there and to go to refine their mentality. So they had the physical coaches, and then they had the Human Performance Institute working on their mind. But the mind and the body, as we all know, are so closely linked that more and more the Human Performance Institute started getting into physical energy. And more it got into working with corporations and how executives could better utilize their energy. And let me sum up an enormous amount of research with 3 points. The first is that what they discovered in the corporate circle was that energy, not time, is the #1 component of success. Most people think it's time management. I'm going to talk about time management in a moment because I think it's very important. But it is energy management in 2 ways. How much physical energy do you have to bring to a task? And second of all, how much emotional energy are you bringing to the task? And they say, look, everybody's talking about absenteeism. The real issue is presenteeism. And we have it probably in this company to some degree. You know, people who are present, but they're not really there. It's presenteeism, isn't it? That's the issue, I think. Particularly, amongst the junior and middle areas. So, how do you address that? You address that by addressing the energy aspects. So, the second discovery they had was that in all their research on executives, they came to the conclusion that the average executive does not work hard enough while they're working. So they have coffees, they have conversations, they're on the net, and all their time and motion analysis says these people are working nowhere near their potential. But the corresponding part of it was they work too long without breaks. And I think that's so true, and I have to say I've been guilty of that myself at times, where I'll work a 12-hour day, but if you really analyse how hard I was working, if I was really ruthless with my time, and I analyse that, I was working kind of 3/4. And say that what their angle is that they say what you've got to do is really push yourself, And don't be afraid of pushing the people under you in a warm way. But then make sure that they're out. Make sure that they're taking breaks. Make sure that they're not spending their whole life working. Because rest is absolutely profoundly fundamental to the performance of the people underneath you. And if you want to look up Human Performance Institute, there's some great white papers and studies you can get on that. So how would you rank yourself on the energy, both attitudinally and physically, that you bring to the task out of 10? The next area is planned innovation. Planned innovation. Now what do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of smart people in this room, and you're intuitively and immediately innovative when you're asked to come up with solutions. And that's wonderful. It really is wonderful. But then there's planned innovation. And what do I mean by this? Well, a lot of people, particularly a lot of ambitious executives, people doing well, believe that success is all about hard work. And there's a lot of truth to that. But only to a certain extent, because what hard work has done for you, and I don't doubt every single person here is working very hard, what hard work has done for you is it's put you to where you are. It's put you in the corporate world way above 90% of people who ever end up in work. Right? So it has worked to a certain extent, but now everybody who's your competition in life, in the corporate world, across all the companies in your sector, well, they all work hard, don't they? And it's it got a declining gain working hard, doesn't it? Because everybody else is intelligent, and everybody else is ambitious, and everybody else at your level is working hard. So how do you get ahead? Most people have actually never thought about this, in my opinion. And when you look at the most successful business people in the world, I'm sure they worked hard, that's a given. But it's innovation. It's the number of ideas that they had that were good, that they implemented, that was the determining factor of where they got. Michael Dell didn't become a multi-billionaire because he outworked everybody at college. He was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in his dorm at college because he had an idea. And the idea was, 30 years ago, that he could sell computers direct via magazine ads. He didn't even build the computers, he just got the parts from somewhere else. It's just the idea, really, that did it. Given that he had to have a lot of work and industry and persistence behind it. Howard Schultz didn't turn Starbucks into one of the biggest retail companies in the world because he worked an extra 3 hours a day longer than the other retailers. It was the idea he had when he was in Italy that America just didn't have Italian-style coffee. Arguably at Starbucks they still don't. He moves them closer. So it was inherently the idea to do a specialist coffee company around the European experience, wasn't it? And here's also his concept of the third place, that you have home, you have work, and there's a third place that you can chill out and relax, which is at a Starbucks. These were the core ideas that actually made Starbucks work. It wasn't working harder. Bill Gates, famous for how hard he worked, famous for falling asleep at his desk. But so is everybody else in Silicon Valley. I mean, it's just legendary how hard people work there. So how did he become, for a long time, the richest person in the world? It's the idea. Everybody was focusing at the time, in the very early 80s, on hardware. Bill Gates, you know, in a world where Apple dominated in hardware, in computers at the time, in personal computers, and IBM dominated in mainframes, hardware. You see, the future's software. It's ideas that move everything forward, get you ahead of the pack. And here's the problem. In a really busy world where, what, do we spend even 3 minutes a day thinking of ideas? Unless, of course, you know, unless put in a brainstorming group. So I'm all for brainstorming groups, but I'm also really all for you taking 20 minutes every day, diarised, to sit there with a blank pad and paper. Don't do your to-do list, come up with ideas. And I think it's absolutely transforming to do that. And I want to give you just 2 techniques, stemming from Edward Bono, the founder of the concept of lateral thinking, that really work. And one is the dictionary method. And all you do is you relate an issue that you have to a simple word. Could be out of a dictionary, could be out of a newspaper. You know, just before we came in, I was talking to Eric, and on the spot, this wasn't an issue at the company. I just said, well, let's say you had an issue with morale. You then relate it to a word like cat. So you think of, how does a cat relate to improving the morale of the people underneath me? Well, cats are always out at night. So maybe we could have a series of events once a month where we go out, our team goes out at night. Cats have 9 lives. So what are the 9 lives of the people underneath me? There's a personal life, there's a physical life, there's a spiritual life for a moment, a social life, there's the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe there's 2 or 3 of these 9 lives that we could actually address to improve the morale. And so you see that by taking a word that is never connected with your issue and just sitting with it for a while, you can come up with stuff that you wouldn't normally come up with. Dictionary method. And then the other method is PO, provocative operation. And what you do with PO is you actually come up with stuff that doesn't make sense, that wouldn't work. And you use it to come up with stuff that would. For example, De Bono was working with Boeing, and he said, Poe, planes should fly upside down. And they had to work with that. Planes should fly upside down. So he said, well, what's good about that if they flew upside down? And one of the things he came up with, well, the cockpit would be, they'd be able to see the runway easier. Why is it that they're at the top? They should be at the bottom. And so that Boeing for a while played around with the idea of cockpits being at the bottom. But only because he came up with the Poe provocative operation, planes should fly upside down. So another one, when he was working with Ford, he said, Poe, cars should have square wheels. Now, why would cars have square wheels? Well, here's one thing. You never fall asleep at the wheel. What you do? All the way down. So that made them think, okay, what can we do? An area, this was in the 70s actually, an area they weren't even addressing was how do we stop people falling asleep at the wheel? This is something we've never even addressed. So provocative operation is a great technique. You use those techniques, whether you think you're personally creative or not, doesn't matter. You're just putting data into a computer and utilizing it a certain way, so being your brain. So using those techniques will work. How do you rank yourself in planned innovation out of 10? The next area I want to talk about is deep preparation. I saw a book, it's the only book I've ever seen on this topic. I saw a book a few years ago called Dare to Prepare. A whole book on preparation. How do you fill a book just on preparation? Well, it was by a top trial lawyer. And what he showed was that preparation really was at the heart of most people's success. And most failures were a result of a lack of preparation, either long-term or short-term. Whether it's for a meeting or a business idea. And I really began to think about that. I thought that's so true. That when we're performing well, it's largely linked to how much preparation we've done. And yet in a fast-moving world, we often wing it. Why do we wing it? Because we're talented. And it's a terrible trap to get into, to believe our talent will get us through it. Because 7 out of 10 times, it does. 3 out of 10 times, we're mediocre. And we know it. And sometimes the people around us know it. Very interesting, this concept of preparation. Aristotle Onassis, the great shipping billionaire, before every meeting, he would sit by himself and play out the part of every person in the room, whether it was his secretary, whether it was the head of the corporation, whether it was someone, one of his managers, and he would act all the parts out before he ever went into any major business deal. Now, do you think there were times where that made him a fortune? Absolutely. It's taking the time to prepare that's so important. When Sydney won the Olympic bid, I read a little about how they did that, and a level of preparation was just stunning. For example, one of the issues was how far the stadium was from the airport. So, unbeknownst to all the Olympic Committee guys and girls when they arrived, every single light was green during their whole stay. So when they drove from the airport out to the stadium, it's not fun. But they're sitting there, they're having arranged with the government to turn every light green. That's preparation. Do you know, I read that they would do, their preparation was so detailed in their actual PowerPoint show that even it was scripted. Even at one point, one person finished a speech that they knew was going to be emotional, and the next speaker came up to the podium and just touched them on the shoulder. As a silent way of saying, we're with you, and really, we're all together. It's all orchestrated. Now, I'm not suggesting you do that when someone does a presentation to you. But what I am saying, that's a level of detail that a seriously great enterprise or series of people go to when something's really at stake. And deep preparation is really important. People talk about Tiger Woods being this freak of a kid as a golfer. It was his training by his father. Do you know that his father, just before he used to play shots, would shout out stuff at him just at the moment where he's going to hit it? Because he said, well, one day someone's going to do that in a major tournament. So if they do it, which I'm sure they do each year, to him, it doesn't affect his stroke play. It's deep preparation. It's no accident that people become so good. Napoleon was asked, do you believe in bad luck? And he said, absolutely, I believe in bad luck. In fact, I believe I'll have it every time, and I prepare for it accordingly. Isn't that great? The next area is time mastery. You look at any of the great leaders in corporations, and at the heart of it is time mastery. Not time management, time mastery. The guy I've been studying a bit lately is Mike Dew, the CEO of Walmart. 2.1 million people underneath him. And he clears his emails every day. He's been known to stand up in the middle of meetings while people are talking and leave, going out like this, because he's reached the end for his time on allocation to that particular meeting. He has 8 folders on a credenza near his desk. And under that, there's a folder for each of the 8 reports that he has. And inside that folder, or on the top is the time of the next meeting, and inside the folder is anything they've been talking about and anything that they've said that they're going to deliver. He just takes the folder out, and studies it, and before they come in, he is ready. Very simple technique, but I've never seen anybody do that. Great technique of time management. Anyone ever heard of Vinod Costa? Costa's a billionaire. He's one of the leading financiers of environmental venture capital. And Kostler has his, I'm not suggesting you do this, but Kostler has his secretary map on a computer and report back to him on a spreadsheet how many times a month he makes it home for his children's dinner at 6 p.m. So you can tell that kind of rigor, it's important to him to be home for his kids' dinner. He has got a certain target of times that he has got to be home for his kids' dinner. And you can bet your life, Kostler is hitting those targets. It's the same in his business life, 100%. You can be sure of that. It's time mastery. David Sokol, anyone ever heard of David Sokol? It's the person that is most likely to take over from Warren Buffett, CEO of numerous companies that Buffett has run. And Buffett himself says, and I've read the quote, that truly, he said, truly, David Sokol does in one day what I do in a week. Now, Sokol's time management is deep, and I suggest you get a book that has never been published, that you can buy in a bookstore in Omaha called Pleased But Not Satisfied. Pleased But Not Satisfied. He self-published, and in it has his time system. But he is always early for every single meeting. Now, if the person's not ready, he studies, but he treats his time brilliantly. Vince Lombardi, the great football coach, he was very famous for having Lombardi time. Lombardi time is you arrive 10 minutes before. So the meeting's at 9 a.m., everybody had to be there at 8:50. It's Lombardi time. Now, I'm not suggesting you do any of these things. All I'm saying is look at their focus, their obsession with time mastery. One of the best things you can do, I think, is have an attitude of urgency. A guy by the professor at Harvard by the name of John Cotter wrote a book purely about urgency as being the #1 emotional paradigm that highly successful business people have. And a great entrepreneur by the name of Kazuo Inamori, who is one of my heroes, he's been Japanese Entrepreneur of the Year twice, tells us of a concept that he has called fight in the center of the ring. And he said this, he said, when you watch a sumo match, it's that they fight in a circle, and the aim is for one sumo to push the other out of the circle, and then they win. And he said, what I've noticed is the sumos only ever really fight desperately when they're near the end of the ring. And he said, I say to myself, why are they not fighting like this when they're in the center of the ring? And he said, the great business leaders fight in the center of the ring. When you don't have that time deadline, you put the time deadline on yourself. When it isn't urgent that you do it, you still work as if there's urgency. As he said, create reserves, then act like you have no reserve. It's a different way of thinking. And finally, I want to talk about what I think is one of the most important concepts of leadership. To be what you say. To be what you say. Congruence congruence is so essential when you're leading people. I really believe that congruence leads to authenticity. People think you're an authentic leader. And when they think you're an authentic leader, they will follow you to the ends of the earth. But if you say one thing and do the other, they'll never mostly point it out to you because they're under you. They want to get a pay rise in 6 months. But the respect lowers, goes down to another level. There's a great saying, who you are screams so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying. Who you are screams so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying. You've got to make your audio match your video. And as the great basketball coach John Wooden said, the best way to improve your team is to improve yourself. An inside-out approach. A couple of examples before I finish. The first is General David Petraeus, a bit of a hero of mine, the guy who turned around Iraq the second time. Now, Petraeus is 59, and he talks to his soldiers about fitness. Now, he's 59, but he has never been beaten in a competition of the amount of push-ups you can do in a minute. No matter how young or fit, and can you imagine how fit some of those special forces guys are? No one has beaten this 59-year-old in number of push-ups in a minute. So when he says you have to get fitter, they get fitter because he lives it. And then, in closing, let me tell you a true story about Gandhi. And of course, Gandhi was idolized by, at the time, probably around 700 million Indians. And one day, a mother had a huge problem with her son eating sugar. And so she travelled across to where Gandhi lived and was eventually able to get an audience with Gandhi. And she brings in her son. And she says, Gandhi, my son is constantly eating sugar. Can you please tell him to stop it? He'll listen to you. And Gandhi says, looks at the son and goes, come back in 2 weeks. So she goes back to her village, travels all the way back. 2 weeks pass. And she comes across, sits down with Gandhi. Gandhi looks at the son and says, don't eat sugar. That's it. It was over. And she said, what do you mean? I've come all the way across India just for you to say, don't eat sugar? Why do you say that? Why wasn't there anything more? She said, he said, well, madam, 2 weeks ago,